Good morning. We look today at Esther chapters 3 through 5. And Esther is always one of those books that as I begin to read it, you get caught up in the story. And that's what happens, especially here in chapters 3 through 5. And then, you just kind of want to go on and read what happens next. And we'll do that tomorrow, or you can do it today if you like. As chapter 2 ended, Mordecai had uncovered a plot for the assassination of the king and had told Esther, and she told the king, and then this tragedy was averted. And after that point in time, Mordecai kind of was forgotten about by the king, or, his name wasn't really mentioned too much, but, the king knew that Mordecai's name had been written in the annals of the king and, in the history. And then chapter 3 begins with the king promoting a man named Haman and advanced him to set his seat above all the officials. So that Haman was second in command of everybody. The king was the king, and then Haman was the second most powerful man in the kingdom. And he thought that everybody should bow to him. Everybody should show him honor, because he was such a great person, and we all know people like that, that because of their title or their position or whatever, think that, boy, they ought to really pay attention to me or whatever. And, they get kind of, we call it, full of themselves. And so that's what Haman was. He was full of himself. And he made a decree that everybody had to bow to him. Everybody had to bow to him as he came by, and could you imagine that? You're doing something, and this person walks by, within your eyesight somewhere. You might not even see him, and you got to bow to him. You're supposed to quit everything you're doing and bow down and la-di-da, praise and honor, and, I guess we all know people that are, if they're there, you are expected to go greet them. They will never come greet you. You are expected, if you don't come greet them, there's something wrong with you. Well, Mordecai was this kind of guy, or not Mordecai, but Haman, and he made this decree that everybody must bow to him. And Mordecai, being the good Jewish person that he is going to bow to no one other than God. The king hasn't made a decree that everybody has to bow to him. They honor him and they recognize who he is. But as far as I know, anyway, you don't have to bow when the king comes by. But Haman made this decree, and Mordecai wouldn't bow to him. And this just bugged Haman to no end. It's one of those deals that Mordecai got on his bad side, and Haman was going to do everything he could, against Mordecai. And then not only against Mordecai, but because Mordecai was a Jew, all the Jews, because one Jew didn't follow what he wanted. Every Jew you couldn't be trusted. You had to get rid of all of them. It's Adolf Hitler, for whatever reason. He had something against the Jews too. And so we have that discrimination is what we call it today. But, just because of one man's action, Haman condemned the whole Jewish nation. And as a revenge plot, he decides he's going to have the king issue a decree that all Jews, male, female, young, old, it didn't matter, any Jew within the kingdom was going to be killed, executed on the 13th day of the 12th month. And he had this written out in an order from the king. And it was signed with the king's signet ring. And as a part of the sweetening of the pot by Haman to the king, he said that, if it pleases the king, I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the king's treasury. And that's in verse 9 of chapter 3. But in verse 11, the king refuses the bribery. He says, the money is given to you and the people as well to do with them as it seems good to you. The king says, I don't want your money. So the king doesn't take the bribe, so the king won't be indebted to Haman that way for this huge amount of money. But the king's secretaries, they write this letter and they send it throughout all the land, and it's read. And this chapter ends with the king, with everybody, having read this letter and it says the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. And this is the city where the king was at the time. It might have been that he had his winter palace there, but it was, he had a place of residence there, and this is where he was. So the city of Susa, where the king's palace was, whatever, was thrown into confusion, as was the rest of the country. Oh, the whole area this king had, what was it, 117 provinces that, when we read in chapter 1. And chapter 4 begins with Mordecai finding out, and he is appalled. He's shocked. He tears his clothes and he puts on sackcloth and ashes, and he goes around, it says, the city wailing with a bitter cry. And the putting on sackcloth and ashes is it's a way of coming to God and showing your dependence, your remorse, showing God that you need him. Basically it was, and we see that often, as Jonah went to, everybody in town put on sackcloth. Jonah wanted to see the city of Nineveh destroyed, but they repented. They put on sackcloth. They appealed to God. And so this was Mordecai's appeal to God. And when Esther finds out that Mordecai has torn his clothes and is wearing sackcloth, she sends a nice set of clothes to him because she doesn't know what's going on. Or when Queen Esther finds this out. And he refuses to put them on. And then he sends information to Esther of everything that is going on and the decree that the king wrote. And she is beside herself with that as well, because she is Jewish as well. If the king finds out that she's Jewish, and she too will be put to death. And Mordecai wonders, when you go to the king and talk to him, and the king has, if anybody just happens to wander into the king's court, unless he points his scepter at him, or he welcomes them, they're going to be put to death. So she hadn't seen the king, it says, for 30 days. And if she was just to walk into his presence, she would be under the threat of death. So she asks Mordecai to pray for her, to fast and to pray for her, so that she might be able to go in front of the king. And the part of this fasting and preparation would be asking God's blessing. This is what, this is a part of the Jewish tradition. And this is part of what Haman has come to the king with, is that these people have different laws. And they had the Mosaic law that they followed, that they, with the worship. And then in chapter 5 begins, on the third day, Esther puts on her best royal garments, and she wanders into the king's vision across the hall, and he welcomes her. He points the scepter, the golden scepter, toward him as she approaches, and he asks, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given, even half of my kingdom." That's a tremendous amount. Here he figures out that the queen has a request. Why else would she come? But she invites him and Haman to her home for a meal. He says, "You'll come today for a banquet that I have prepared." And so the king and Haman go. And they were eating there, drinking their wine. He asks again, "What is your petition?" And she says that you and Haman would come to a banquet that I will prepare for you tomorrow night. And the king agrees to that. And Haman, he's filled with pride to just, again, he had been full of himself. Now he is even more full of himself. And he goes around bragging, "The queen is preparing a meal, and it's just me and the king that are invited." Whoop-de-doo, and he's all excited and just, full of pomp, just pumped up with himself. And as he's preparing to go, he's still brooding and still upset about Mordecai. And then it comes out, that his wife says, he says, all this does me no good as long as I see the Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. And, he's got a position of power. He's got basically everything anybody could ever imagine. And yet he lets this one thing eat at him. And it's a reminder for us that, something's eating at you. Don't let it eat at you and destroy you. Give it up. Let it go. But Mordecai, or Haman couldn't let the refusal of Mordecai to bow to him go. And it just ate at him. And then the idea is, it says, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made. And a cubit is 18 inches. So 50, that's 75 feet tall, roughly. Let it be made. And in the morning, tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. And then go to the banquet with good spirits. It's, here we've got this plan now to get rid of Mordecai. So you can let go of this thing that's been eating at you, knowing that in the morning Mordecai will be gone. There will be no more Mordecai to not bow to you, to cause you problems, to just irritate you to no end, But, so this advice pleased Haman, it says, and he had the gallows built. That's how our reading ends today. And it's one of those, it just wants you to read on, and I cheated. I've already read part of it, but I've read it before. But it's, the lessons for us are, to be content with what we have, to not, when something irritates you, and I've got things that irritate me, and I got to just let them go, you just got to not let it get under your skin, and it's a hard thing to do, but it's a lesson that we need to learn and to remember that all of that, to let go of those things, and the reminder from Mordecai and from Queen Esther and the Jewish people is to remember God always and to trust in God's mercy and grace. May you do so today.